So we should be, okay. And as soon as I start the webinar, I should go live. So now live, we are live. Everything is, okay. It's waiting for us to start. All right, you guys ready? Okay, the webinar is now live.
All right. Should we get started now or wait a couple minutes?
Maybe 12:05 so that people can come in. Oh, there are 92 people. Hey, guys.
Hello.
I'm going to ask people to comment their questions below.
It's an incredible time to be Black in microbiology and to have this forum. Thank you all for hosting it and putting together such an excellent program for the week.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Oh, I think
probably get started.
I think someone raised their hand.
So I guess a few questions, a few things. So if you do have questions, so I guess we can get started and give people kind of instructions.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Linnell Williams. I'm one of the organizers, along with Felipe, who will introduce himself for Black and Micro. I'm a graduate student at Harvard. I study virus physics. And I'm super excited to be here with two amazing people to kind of talk about COVID-19.
Yeah, and I'm Felipe. I'm a PhD student at the University of Michigan. My PhD thesis is actually on bacteria, so I'm a kind of a traitor, but I definitely started out as a cytomegalovirus biologist, and then I did a lot of work on HIV/AIDS advocacy. So stick around for the 4 o'clock with Leon Golson. I'll be there as well. Novita, do you want to give a short introduction?
Sure. I'm Professor Vita Fuller. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Microbiology and Immunology at the University of Michigan, where Felipe is also there. And I have studied herpes simplex virus in the laboratory for years, but in the last 10 to 15 years have begun doing implementation science with HIV to move what we know about HIV into community. And of course, now with the COVID pandemic, I'm finding myself engaged with COVID education and information as we discover it, as scientists and clinicians understand what's going on with the novel coronavirus. So it's a joy to join this panel today.
Yes, thank you so much. So yeah, this is going to be very informal. We don't have a very strict presentation for you all. This is meant to be a Q&A. So please, there is a Q&A option at the bottom, and someone's already asked a couple of questions. So go ahead and keep doing with those, and then we'll try to answer them as well.
And before we start, I'd like to first say that Black in Microbiology would like to thank all of its sponsors for helping to make this event possible. We would like to especially thank our gold level sponsors, the American Society for Microbiology, the American Society for Virology, and Qiagen. Their generous support has been very instrumental to the success of Black in microbiology this week and beyond, and we appreciate their continued efforts in supporting and recognizing Black microbiologists and their contributions. As Felipe has said, please use the Q&A box. If you're watching live, please comment below the live stream that's happening on Twitter on the Black and Microbiology page. I will be watching that and basically asking questions. And as Felipe said, this is a very informal sort of way for us to answer your questions about COVID-19, about viruses, etc. And we have a very, very special guest here, Dr. Fuller, who has done a lot of work in this area as well.
So I see a couple questions in the Q&A. Shall we dive right in?
Let's dive right in. So what can we do, Dr. Fuller, now that we know that SARS-CoV-2 transmit through aerosols? How do we prevent transmission? How do we protect ourselves?
Right. So I'm not surprised that COVID is being recognized as transmitting through aerosols. That's how the common cold virus and some others are transmitted. Respiratory drops are thought to be the bigger pieces that fall to the ground, but aerosols are like in the Michigan winter when it's cold outside and you go out and you breathe out and you see that fog come out because the air droplets are turning cold and condensing. So wearing a mask. So first of all, isolating or staying home when you don't have to be out is very important. We're not in lockdown anymore. We're not in stay home, stay safe or shelter in place. Businesses are open and restaurants are open and grocery stores are open, but that doesn't mean our mentality should change. We still need to stay away from each other and not allow our bodies to become a possible place for the virus to reproduce. So one, staying away from other people in your own home or wherever you are as much as possible. Two, when you do go out, wear a mask. Such that if you are in a store or in a place that anything you're breathing out is captured by the mask and there is some protection for anything that is in the air. Thirdly, stay distant from people. That 6 feet or more distance is very important because unless something is sneezed or propelled, it will not likely go past 6 to 8 feet unless there's something to take it. And there are things like air conditioning drafts or other things that can blow things. But in general, 6 to 8 feet or more away from another person will allow the aerosols to not reach you to be inhaled. Particularly if you have a mask and other people have a mask, that is the best protection. I know there's pushback against masks, but I can tell you, I don't see any way forward for us to conquer COVID without people wearing masks when they're out in public. Most people, all people, everybody has to do this. So following those preventions, those basic guidelines, and of course, washing your hands frequently. So we now know that the virus can remain on surfaces like doorknobs or handrails or stair rails or faucets. So wash your hands. Just make it a habit to do it if you have soap and water, but if not, always have the alcohol-based material there. A friend of mine gave me one that fits around my keychain, my keys, my car keys. And so, if I'm going in the grocery store, it's right there with my keys. So before I touch my car, I can alcohol swab my hands, or as soon as I get in the car, before I touch the steering wheel, I can do that. So doing these things is very important to reduce the amount of circulating virus such that fewer people become infected and serve as incubators, if you will, for producing COVID virus.
Yeah, I think it's extremely important, especially the mask wearing. I was just in an argument with, a friend of mine about like how important it was how important it is to actually like wear a mask. I almost think about it. So some mathematicians actually like recently like talked about, thinking about the number of like virus particles it takes to like even infect a human being, and thinking about it that way in a way. So by you not wearing a mask, you're like, giving off a lot more particles than like you would if you had one on, right? And so by wearing a mask, you reduce the chance of you basically giving off more viral droplets that have virus particles in them that eventually end up infecting other people. So you're essentially reducing the risk.
Right. And very quickly to just address Joe James, they're bringing up that Florida masks are no longer required by the state. I think Dr. Fuller, you very well said that even though our policy around us are changing, that doesn't mean that our mental mindset has to change. We still know that there are things that can prevent us from COVID infection. And regardless if it's legally required or not, we can still do those things.
Absolutely.
And one thing about the mathematicians, So there's also this talk about outside versus inside.
Mhm.
So you bring a good point that it's not necessarily that if one COVID particle enters our lung, that's a very, very low risk of us actually becoming infected and or developing a disease. So when we're outside, there are winds around us, there's more air, there's more ventilation. So even if some COVID virus does, leave a person's mouth, it's immediately diluted and dispersed to a very low concentration so that if someone 8 feet away were also there, the amount of virus should be low enough that it doesn't, there's a low risk of infection. Now, when you couple that with wearing masks, once again, it's even a much lower risk of infection. So outdoor, wearing masks, if you can't stay home, those are the best things for us to do.
Yeah, it's really about reducing risk. And it's often easy to get caught up in these technicalities. Well, I can technically stand outside or I can technically be inside and do X, Y, Z. And I think everyone should just be doing their part to keep everyone safe and reducing the risk. There is another question right after. It's by an anonymous attendee that says, are we really ever going to get out of this pandemic anytime soon? And just to reiterate, please don't raise your hands because we won't be able to see them, because if you have questions, be sure to put them in the Q&A and we're just going to kind of go down the list and answer as many of them as we possibly can. Thank you so much.
There was a very interesting article in Politico looking at the end game for COVID and making a sort of a prediction, and so I kind of agree with that it's going to take, well, let me say, we may never ever get rid of COVID. I have a feeling as a virologist that this has evolved as a zoonotic virus from animals into the human realm. It is adapted very well to humans. We had coronavirus before. We had several human coronaviruses that caused a more serious common cold-like illness. Then we had SARS back in, I believe, 2002, and then we had MERS, both of which were shut down because they were not highly, highly contagious. They did both cause respiratory illness, but COVID has evolved to be one, highly contagious. It is very easy to spread it from person to person. And if you ever look at any of the electron micrographs that Dr. Elizabeth Fisher has made from the NIH, you see that one cell is producing hundreds, if not thousands, of virus. And so it is very dense and it's very good at colonizing or infecting the epithelial cells of the respiratory tract. So how are we ever going to get out of it? I think we will be able to manage it. And to manage it, it means that we have to get the number of people that are producing virus down to such low levels that if we're doing widespread testing, that less than 3% of the population that's being tested, so lots of people have to be tested, are testing positive. This is the math. And then for those who are testing positive, that COVID, those coronavirus infections will have to be controlled by isolating that person for the 14 days and contact tracing every person that person has been in contact with to give them a test or telling them to isolate until they know whether they have symptoms or not. So what we're saying is COVID is here to stay. At the moment, we're not at a level where we can control COVID. It is controlling us, meaning that we have to just now do what we have to do by public health preventions. When we have a vaccine, and if we have a vaccine, the combination of the public health preventions, which we just talked about, the vaccines, which FDA says that if they're 50% effective, they can be, they're eligible for approval. That doesn't mean they will be approved, but that's the cutoff line. So that means that they're 50% not effective, which means we still need the public health things. So the long end game is that we will be able to use everything we have, public health, natural immunity, if it does happen, and we don't even know if it happens, the vaccine, and those people who've gotten infected before not being reinfected, to knock the levels down low enough that contact tracing and testing can manage the people. And then, of course, when we go out in public, we're still probably, there's certain things we're going to have to wear masks for. There's certain things we're going to have to be screened for. Our world has been changed, in my opinion, forever. Hopefully, we won't have these high levels forever, but I don't believe COVID is going to go away ever.
I think there's a related point in the Q&A as well. Someone asked if vaccines, you touched on this already, but just to expand a little bit more, if vaccines protect against disease, but not against infection, what is the end game? Do we ever get to stop wearing masks?
Sorry about that.
No problem.
Do we ever get to stop wearing masks? And do vaccines protect against, what was the other part? Protect against?
I think they said protect against disease.
Right. So the flu vaccine is an example of where we hope it protects against severe disease. That doesn't mean it protects against infection. The idea with influenza is if you get a vaccine, you may get infected with flu, but it won't make you really, really, really sick because you've given your immune system a boost or a jump to be able to handle flu sooner. So it may be that the COVID vaccines will be like that it will not protect against infection, but protect against severe illness. And will we ever be able to get rid of wearing masks? I don't think we'll always have to wear them as much as we have to wear them now. But I do think there's certain circumstances, like maybe a concert or a crowded situation or other places where there may be times where there are epidemics that have spiked, that we need to say, don your mask. Or other cases where you're going to be in a close proximity with people that you don't know from the same household, it would be wise to have everybody wear a mask. So I think we'll just have to wait and see. But the way that COVID is highly infectious, as well as can cause severe disease and a plethora of those things, and the way it seems to affect the body, I think we're going to have to use everything we have in the arsenal to control it.
Yeah, if I may clarify one thing. So vaccines like the flu, you're right, they don't directly protect against all infection, meaning it is possible that even if you're vaccinated for the flu, you still may have a flu infection in your lungs. You may look at your lungs and there's some flu there, but it is an inefficient infection. So it may lower the amount of viruses in your lungs if you've already have been primed for that year's flu virus. And if that infection is ineffective or maybe weaker, then when you're out talking, maybe there's less amount of flu that you're spreading out there. Absolutely. And then maybe someone who does not have the vaccine, maybe they're not able to, maybe they have a condition where they're not allowed to have vaccines. In that way, you are preventing disease and infection, because now maybe the amount of virus that you're spitting out is not enough to infect someone else. So there's, especially with these communicable diseases, it's very easy to get stuck on how will this affect me? And that is important. But what we do, wearing masks, getting vaccines for the flu, staying home when we feel sick, these things not only affect us, but they affect others. Absolutely. So it's also, even though it may not directly help you, it may help others and save a life.
Could I just quickly follow up on that and say,
yes, please. One
of the reasons that I believe the U.S. is having such a hard time with coronavirus is because we're so individually minded. What you just said, Felipe, about I may not be at high risk, so I should be able to do what I want. If I want to get together with my friends, we're not going to get COVID. But what if one of my friends becomes asymptomatically infected and goes home to her mother or grandmother or neighbor or society, or even another young adult who has some underlying or less host defense, and that person gets severely sick or the persons related to them. So my point is that by keeping the level of virus as low as possible, by everybody preventing infection, we take care of each other. Individual actions are trumped by the community well-being. And that's hard for Americans to wrap our brain around because we're so used to the individual freedoms that allow us to be who we are. But in this case, it's the group effort that's really necessary. The group well-being is really critical, that's contributed to by everybody, every individual's actions.
And the group effort is really important. And I guess to kind of go a little bit more into what we've been talking about, Christine Nagaro asked, are there concerns about SARS-CoV-19, the virus, about it being able to mutate and affect efforts for creating vaccines in the future, especially considering the high number of infections across the world right now?
Yeah, great question. And the answer is we do not know. What I do know, there was a recent paper published out of Texas that sequenced over 5,000 coronavirus strains, and there are changes, but they're not changes in places that make an antigenic protein change. And then the one that does seem to be to mutate enough to be retained by the virus so far doesn't seem to make it any more virulent, or as we can tell so far, any more likely to be transmitted. It is an RNA virus. There are fewer corrections for RNA viruses in the cells. So therefore we have a chance of it mutating, but it's not like flu and it's not like some other RNA viruses that have a small genome. So there are people that can speak to fitness a lot better than I can, but the hope is, and I don't think there's data yet, remember this is a novel virus, to say that this virus will not be mutating around the vaccines that will have some protection as they go through the clinical trials. We don't know, but that's the hope.
Awesome.
Great.
I think we could switch gears here because the next couple of questions are about sort of the impact of COVID on minority communities in particular. So an anonymous attendee asked, can we speak to the factors that contribute to the outsized impact of this disease on minority populations, and what interventions and policies could help to reduce that disparity? And I want to add Rachel Buckard's question to this about how do we continue to communicate what we've been talking about transmission and mass to communities, in particular minority communities that may not trust science?
Wow, there are a lot of questions here, and they are not simple questions. I'm just going to say, I just came off a 2.5-hour course with clergy in a region that I'm in, and I'm glad we were talking about these things, because otherwise I'm not sure I'd be ready to deal with these questions. Woo. All right. So the first one was, could you say that again?
So thinking about the impact of the disease on minority populations, and like why the disparity is so sized for that.
Sure. So it began to be clear in early April that the number of COVID severe cases, hospitalizations, and deaths were higher among Black Americans and Latinx Americans, and even now Native Americans. And so for example, in our county, which is 14% African American, the stats showed that 28% of the deaths, or maybe even 44%, I think early on, were among African Americans. And if you look at that in Chicago, if you look at that in Louisiana, you look at that around the country, you see similar disproportions where the population is this amount, but the severe illness and deaths were much higher. And so that clearly showed that there's a health disparity. And what it did was to pull back, if you will, that it's not only for COVID, that's true for many illnesses. That's true for influenza. That's true for heart disease. That's true for cancer. And it isn't that Black Americans are inherently less well. It's just that if you look at a number of things, one, you look at the places where many African Americans and people of color live, it's more dense. And so with the contagious virus like COVID, that is airborne, the more people you have in a space, whether it's in a room, a house, environment, wherever that is, the more chances you have of breathing in that. Secondly, people of color in America tend to have the frontline jobs that require us not to be able to work from home. We have to go out to drive the bus. We have to go out to do the things that we do that help this country to continue to running. Who stocks the grocery store shelves? Who makes sure that the food gets loaded onto trucks to be taken to places? So
cleans hospital rooms.
Yeah.
Who cleans hospital rooms? Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So those jobs require that we're out in the environment. The frontline workers are more exposed. Then we get to things that are social behavioral, the inherent biases. I have so many people that have told me how when we were having to meet certain criteria to get a prescription to get high priority for tests, and that's another issue. We just need multiple tests to be available easily for anybody, anytime, whether they've been tested once or not. So, but early on, people could not get tested because they maybe only had one of the 4 symptoms of COVID. So go home, you probably have pneumonia, or you probably have an allergy, or you probably have asthma. Whereas now we're realizing there are multiple symptoms of COVID. And so just saying, do you have shortness of breath, fever, a cough, or body aches may not cover the myriad of symptoms, like loss of smell or loss of taste. It's one of the first obvious things that happens very early on for some people who are infected with coronavirus, with SARS coronavirus 2. So a lot of the reason of the impact on the minority community is because of the conditions that we live in, the jobs that we do, and then the inherent biases, whereas I may show up with a couple of symptoms, but you think it's not COVID because you just don't think it is, and you send me home instead of saying, well, let's check your temperature, or let's do this, or let's have you tested anyway. We're not given the benefit of that doubt. And then a fourth reason is the misinformation that circulates in the community. We are often thought of as, well, it won't affect Black folks, or it won't affect people of color. And that's not true. We're just as susceptible, and we sometimes don't even accept that it's something I don't believe that's going to bother me. Well, of course, if you're a human being, this is a virus that's simply looking for a place to reproduce, just like with HIV, just like flu. They're not trying to hurt us. They're not trying to destroy us. They're just trying to replicate. And whoever makes themselves available, they will use that opportunity to reproduce themselves. So there are lots of reasons that this has a huge impact on the minority community, including access to healthcare. Many people just can't call up a primary healthcare provider and say, this is how I feel, what would you recommend? We end up going to the emergency room or to urgent care because of the medical care. Unfortunately, medical access is a little bit better, but it's a feature still.
Yeah, I was just about to bring up the healthcare issues. There's a lot of us, I would even say people I know personally, who don't have access to healthcare, especially in states where that's a lot harder, like states where I'm from in Tennessee. And so it's interesting because when people are attempting to get care for the things that they need, they eventually do have to go to the emergency room if they have chest pain, or if they have even symptoms that you would probably normally just call your doctor up for. And you also touched on something I thought was extremely important, and that's like the sort of belief that because we're like people of color, we're somehow immune to this virus, or immune to certain diseases, because only white people you don't get these things. And it reminds me of some of the more religious conversations I've had with even members of my family who yes, believe in the virus, but also believe that you can just kind of pray this away, or we'll just be okay at the end of the day. And it would be great if either of you can also touch on that as well.
This is Dr. Fuller all the way. Can you pray away coronavirus?
Can you pray it away?
Wow, you're really putting me on the spot here. I'm a person of faith. I'm actually an ordained minister, former pastor, as well as a virology scientist. So I believe that let me just say, I think COVID is a natural biological change where when the world, in my opinion, was created, it was created with change built in. We adapt. It isn't like somebody has a stay intended. If you put a plant in front of a window, it's going to turn its leaves to the light. If you put it in the closet, it's going to not do so well. So the point is that I believe COVID naturally evolved, and I believe that science and medical-based evidence is what we are given. Science is a process by which we understand nature. And so we have to use what we are learning as we learn it from science to deal with this. Can we pray it away? Well, we can certainly pray, and I definitely believe in the power of prayer. But how does God answer that prayer? Perhaps through the science and medicine to reveal what's going on, so we have ways of keeping safe. We have ways of keeping safe, following the public health preventions, the stay home if you don't have to be out, cover your mouth and your mask up, stay away from other people, don't gather in parties. I'm even saying, yes, I want my adult children to come home for Thanksgiving, but this may be a year that you guys stay in Atlanta and Maryland, because it will be safer for all of us not to get together. You don't have to travel. And your dad and I, who are in that age where we're more susceptible, will not be put at risk. So what am I saying? I'm saying, yes, we can pray, but God also gives us wisdom. I don't think God can do anything, in my opinion. Prayer, nothing is impossible. There is divine miracles. There are divine miracles. There is a divinity. But more so than looking for those miracles, let's use what we have been given through science and medicine that help us to navigate these times, and use that wisely. So I hope that does answer the question. I don't think we can pray away COVID, but I think we can listen to what we are given and cover it also with prayer. And yes, there are miracles all the time. I know people who got infected and they tell the story, and you think, with all you're telling me, why aren't you dead? And it's because somebody prayed for them, in my opinion, and somebody gave them good medical care. The two go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much. That's definitely important, especially within religious people. So switching gears a little bit, and there's just so many questions that at this point I'm just going through and choosing the best ones. So I'm just going to read it. What might be some ways that we can reconcile the need to be spread out 6 feet apart and wearing masks with the fact that the people most being hurt by the virus are often homeless and need to find assistance in crowded shelters or otherwise marginalized people? I would add to that people in prison.
Yeah, that's
right?
what
Their lives matter, and they really have no choice. So once again, it goes to me, right? This is my opinion. It goes back to what can we do for the group, right? If you have the privilege of staying home and isolating in your home, do it. If you have the privilege to wear a mask and have masks readily available to you, wear it. Because some people do not have that issue. Right. These things are connected. So yes, there's COVID and there's these simple guidelines that we can make, but poverty, homelessness, these are social problems that we have. They're not going to be cured in a year. Even if all COVID is cured in a year, which I'm not saying will happen, but homelessness and poverty are things that will continue. And especially for those populations, people who can't get a vaccine, even if there is one, right? It's our duty for the people who can, the privileged people. I will say that I'm definitely very privileged that I can stay home and still get paid and do work. If those people, the majority of people, do their responsibility, do their due diligence and wear masks, stay home when they can, we're not only helping ourselves, but we're helping people who really need our help. Yeah. Anything else to add to that?
I think you answered the question. Those are examples where the necessary closeness of people because of the circumstance happens. The best that we can do is help those political leaders and people who are responsible for what happens to make policies. So we need to vote and be informed voters. But then the other piece that you mentioned, Felipe, is just to simply try to
hear you.
Oh, okay. I changed the mic. Okay, let me change it back. It's just to keep the level of virus that's available in the population as low as possible. And unfortunately, the prisons are just the environment there, or even the homes for the homeless, the shelters. The best that can be done is to provide as much provisions as possible in terms of protective care and keep the virus as low as possible. And that's something all of us are part of doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially when winter's coming, and I'm in Michigan, and there's also a significant risk of health for staying outside in the middle of February. So
absolutely,
people have to make the choice. Yeah, I could get COVID if I'm in the shelter, but I could also die outside from the elements. So just staying on top of it, voting for people who believe in healthcare for everybody, including homeless people. Yeah.
I think when I hear those kinds of arguments, especially arguments against wearing masks and following regulations by folks who are more privileged, especially, I say to them, you know, are the things you want a leisure or an actual like requirement for your life? Right? Or the things that you are attempting to ask for, like being able to go on vacation and being able to sit in a restaurant, or those things that are essential to your living, or are those just things that you want to do, or are they just leisure? And I think that when we attempt to take the sort of plight of folks who don't have the privilege, again, to work from home and still get paid, for people who don't have a home, for people who are forced to work in like very close proximity, or live with people, you know, in very close proximity, we completely ignore the fact that they, in many cases, they don't necessarily have that luxury or that choice. And for you to have that luxury and that choice to be able to choose between whether or not you keep yourself and other people safe or not, should just automatically give you your answer. Again, it's even when we think about like the most vulnerable populations, or populations that might be more susceptible or more vulnerable, just reminding yourself that, you know, if you do have a choice, then you probably have a lot of privilege, and you probably should just follow the regulations and be uncomfortable for a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm thinking of the meat packing plants where people had to go there for work. There is legislation and understanding that the people who have the power to make choices need to understand and make better choices. So those people have to work, and they unfortunately have to work in those conditions, but the people who allow that need to be voted out of office.
Yeah. All right, let's start doing some rapid fire here, because the questions are building up. Can women with confirmed or suspected COVID-19 breastfeed? Is that, oh, you're muted.
We can't hear
Dr.
you,
Fuller?
Dr. Fuller.
I don't know the answer to that. I know that there's now new evidence that women who are pregnant can transfer it to their child. I'm thinking that that's in utero and at birth, but I don't know the answer about whether it's transmitted in breast milk. So I don't know.
So
Dr. Taylor just said yes.
Yeah.
And she is a COVID biologist.
Okay, super.
So, yes.
Yes. So I think that, yeah, I thank you, Dr. Taylor, for that. I also wanted to add that, like, keep in mind, especially for people who are in the general public, science takes a long time. Like, you know, the COVID pandemic has only been around for a few months, and it just, you know, when we're doing our day-to-day all the time, it takes months and months and even years sometimes to produce, you know, different studies and find out new information that will be helpful to us. So for this thing to be a very brand new thing, you know, it's great to be following what studies say, but it's good to also think about those studies as just studies, and like keep in mind that this is something new and developing all the time. And then I think Dr. Taylor has also added to the breastfeeding question that breastfeeding provides antibodies not passed in breast milk to, you know, our knowledge.
I see a question that's really easy to answer that's important. It says, Amanda says, can you clarify the nomenclature of the virus versus the disease it causes? This is basic, and we do know the answer to that. So the disease that it causes is COVID-19, which is like AIDS is the disease that HIV causes. The virus that originally was called novel coronavirus, because it was a new evolved coronavirus, is now SARS-2 coronavirus. So it's a severe acute respiratory virus 2 coronavirus. And so the virus is SARS coronavirus or coronavirus 2, and the disease is COVID-19. I hope that helps.
When we get an effective vaccine, will people be justified when they say they don't wear a mask? No. I think we have to use multiple ways of reducing risk to combat this virus, right? So this is, I also think of, the flu. I'll get the flu vaccine, but if I'm feeling sick, I'll still stay home because I don't want to spread that to other people as well. So just because you have a vaccine, I think wearing a mask is just a very low effort way to very significantly decrease the risk of spreading these viruses. Can COVID-19 and influenza, can there be co-infections?
Again, I don't know if we absolutely know the answer, but as from a virology point of view, I would think so. They're two different viruses. The immune system would arise against both, but I don't see any reason that we know of, that they cannot be co-infection. This is another reason we're encouraging everyone to get a flu shot to keep the flu viruses low in circulation, meaning that we're not producing virus. And two, people are not getting sick with flu, so that if there are lots of symptoms that fit into the wide range for COVID, they know that they should probably get a test for COVID and assume that they have COVID or coronavirus, to use the right terminology, until it's proven one way or the other.
Yeah, and Dr. Taylor, once again, thank you, our silent hero. There are documented cases of co-infection. But once again, I think Linnell said it, this is still the beginning. We still a lot of unanswered questions. Is it just the flu symptoms plus the COVID symptoms, or when there's a co-infection, are there different symptoms that arise? I don't think that we know yet, but I think what is important to know from these cases of co-infection is now more than ever, it is so important to get your flu shot, because there is currently no vaccine for COVID. We should do that this year for sure.
Let's see. Oh, there's one that's kind of related to the universities. So what are your opinions on how universities are staying open despite the threat of the virus increasing on campuses? This is by Jeremy DeRoche. I think for me, this is kind of personal. As a graduate student, I feel like I am choosing between my own health and safety and whether or not I can get my PhD done. And so I think that for me, it's very scary to think about the times that we're living in terms of those of us, especially who are in academia. If there was ever a time to show any kind of grace and empathy to all of us, to graduate students, to essential workers, to faculty members, this would be the time. And to see that our universities are unable, especially universities that are grossly, who have gross endowments like Harvard University.
Michigan.
And in Michigan, I had just, to throw it out there, who are unable, unfortunately, to, pay or provide, this kind of compensation without still bringing us in over this time. I think it's kind of sad because it makes me think as a graduate student that if I can work through this pandemic, I can work through anything. And I wonder moving forward what the academic environment will be moving forward, whether or not we will even be able to maintain our wellness and safety ever in the future, again, if we're not getting any empathy now. But yes, I personally think that as a graduate student in particular, I think that it's unfair to put a lot of us in this position where, because academia wants to continue as, business as usual, essentially, they're willing to basically sacrifice, our safeties.
Yeah.
Just a thought about universities. My husband was on a panel for his university, a faculty team beginning back in May and June about reopening. And just to realize that what we're dealing with is something that we've not seen in modern history. And so one of his colleagues shared the thought that trying to figure out how to safely reopen universities and schools was like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. And what we mean by that is that the situation is changing. What might have been a low level of coronavirus circulating in Michigan at a given time, where panels and administrators are trying to figure out the policies and how to keep people safe and what testing to require, those conditions that those very nuanced actions were meant to deal with, by the time September rolls around, may be very different, not because of the students, but just because of the environment. So the point is, it's a moving target. This is a very, very alive epidemic that is changing based on what individuals do. And so it's hard. I'm not making any excuses for universities, but it's very difficult to know what to do for the circumstance that may be different the next week. So it's not a simple problem that we're trying to solve here.
Mm-hmm. So just there is one from an anonymous attendee. How does COVID differ from the flu? I hear a lot about similarities, but not about the differences. And we've come prepared. So you should see an infographic that we made about the big three, as we're calling it. These three viruses that we've all heard about, that probably has affected a lot of people around us, maybe even ourselves. So maybe just very quickly, we can go between these three and talk about the differences, because the question's talking about the differences. The biggest one, in my opinion, is that there's a flu vaccine, and there's not one for COVID. So while COVID, we're having to resort to things like staying home, which is, I can admit, very annoying for us. When we're wanting to go out and be social, wearing a mask, which with someone that wears glasses, it's hard to see. I understand that. But with flu, there's already a vaccine. So there's, while all of those things for COVID are very uncomfortable, they're still very much necessary to significantly reduce the amount of risk of spreading COVID. With the flu, we can still do all those things, but we also have a vaccine on top of that. So get your flu vaccine. Additionally, if you are infected with COVID versus influenza, is there any drug that specifically has been specifically targets that specific virus? Is there any drugs on the market approved by the FDA? For the flu, there is. So there are medications, some are called Tamiflu, that target the way the flu reproduces its own genetic material. So there are ways, if you have the flu, to take some medicine. For COVID, there is not. So yes, once again, it's really important to do all these preventative methods in order to combat COVID. Dr. Fuller, did you have?
I was just going to simply say, with flu, typically it's given to people who have chances of more severe illness, Tamiflu and a couple other drugs, but not to most people who would handle flu with their immune system. And with COVID, there are no.
I think you froze up.
Yeah, I think she froze.
Yes, I think she was going to say there are no therapies directly for COVID. It's more about maintaining symptoms, making sure that that patient can breathe. So how do I decrease the risk of transmission? This is where things start to get more similar than different, right? So in addition to the vaccine for flu, ways to prevent COVID and flu are very similar. Stay at home if you're sick. Wear a cloth mask if you can't stay home. Oh no, hopefully we can get Dr. Fuller back. How it spread is once again same. So I don't think it was addressed yet, but there is even some talk about, I don't like wearing masks because it's hard to breathe. So actually there's no evidence that wearing a cloth mask does not allow you to breathe, right? So we can still have oxygen go very freely between the mask, but what the mask prevents, what it's a barrier for, is that those respiratory droplets that when you talk or sing or even just breathe, that's how the virus can go around and spread.
Yeah, especially the larger droplets in particular are the ones that get caught and typically have more virus in them. And so it's extremely important that you guys are like wearing masks, especially if, you know, you're going to be out as well. So that doesn't mean, again, like as we said in the beginning, it's not 100%. Of course, there might be smaller droplets that might get through or around the mask, et cetera. But this is all about preventing, you know, reducing the risk of actually catching COVID and reducing the amount of virus that might be in the air that might cause an infection. Yeah.
Right. And once again, I keep seeing the argument about masks is that, well, if they're not 100% effective, then why even bother? Seatbelts are not 100% effective. Condoms are not 100% effective, right? The only way that's 100% effective to not get in a car wreck and die is to not get in a car.
Exactly.
People need to get in cars, right? The only way to, well,
Prevent
through,
pregnancy.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, I thought you were going to say prevent pregnancy.
Right, is to not have sex, right? The most common way that HIV is spread is through sex. So one way to not do it, to not spread HIV, is to never have sex, but people have sex, right? So what are other ways of these tools that we use to decrease risk? That's what we're talking about here.
Hi, Dr. Fuller.
You're back.
Finish your thought.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Our housekeeper is here and hit the router. Yeah.
We have about 5 minutes as well, so maybe we can take one or two more like quick questions and then close out.
Yes.
Yeah. There's so many good ones. You guys, there's so many questions here.
Wow.
So we can stop sharing the screen now.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I cannot see the questions at the moment, so you guys will have to field them, unfortunately.
Yeah,
no problem.
There's so many. It's like trying to pick one.
How do we keep other disease-causing agents like HIV, tropical illnesses on the forefront of funding view as SARS-CoV-2 has taken full attention of everyone? Yeah. There are definitely, as a scientist, extra funding mechanisms for people who study SARS-2, but HIV is not going anywhere, flu is not going anywhere. These other illnesses are also. So I don't think it's, those funding mechanisms are still there. It's about addressing and getting COVID under control and learning as much biology as we can. And the thing is, I think, Dr. Fuller, you mentioned this, but coronavirus is not new, right? We know a lot about coronaviruses in general, and a lot of that biology that has come from basic science research is actually helping us a lot. And I think people are noticing that too.
Coronavirus did not get much attention. There were people doing research, but obviously not enough. Somebody mentions, what about remdesivir, which is a FDA-approved drug for treating COVID severe patients. So there is one COVID drug, but it's usually used to help people who are very severely ill, perhaps to come back from the brink of death.
Yeah, I want to also add that the funding of basic science is extremely important, even across all of the sciences. So even there have been a lot of people, like a lot of those models that you guys are seeing and like hearing about in the news, especially, are from folks who are in the quantitative sciences as well. And even more recently, I was speaking about earlier that like the pandemic has not only like broken away or opened our like lack of knowledge of, you know, biology, but it's also exposed our lack of knowledge of like other fields like physics in particular. So one of the biggest issues right now is understanding how to sanitize masks. And a lot of the understanding of how we sanitize masks properly, especially, actually lies in soft condensed matter physics in particular. There are quite a few labs who are across, you know, other institutions who are doing a lot of work towards thinking about how do we sort of properly clean our mask in a way using soft matter science in particular, detecting viruses in particular. A lot of people who are in optics, et cetera, who are getting research funding to invest in how we can maybe detect viruses, you know, at the airport, et cetera. So I think that in general, like this has kind of opened you know, opened the importance of why we should like fund basic research in particular. So funding for basic research, the federal government, I think, is around like 0.2% in general. And so that literally, if there was like an inflation in the numbers one year in our federal budget, we could double or triple science if they decided to. So imagine what we can do with twice the funding that we currently have. And so it's important that we be staying in not in just in connection with the, you know, bench science and the research, but also in connection to some of the things we talked about earlier about policy and advocating for money for the sciences as well.
Just as a closing statement, I just want to say that it's important that individuals take on the responsibility for the group impact. If each of us does everything we can to make sure that we are not infected and being spreading virus, then that will help to reduce the amount of circulating virus in the environment. And that will ultimately go a long way to managing COVID, to getting it to a place where testing and contact tracing can keep people safe. But that's an individual choice that we make all the time, and it's not easy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, we're unfortunately really out of time. There's so many good questions. But I want to thank Lynell and Dr. Fuller so much for being here with me. Thank you so much, Dr. Fuller, for donating your time to us and your expertise and your intellect. We definitely appreciate it. So please come to our 4 p.m. and 6 p.m. Eastern time session. So 4 p.m. I'll be talking once again with Leon Golson, a very important member of that helps with HIV transmission. He's a director of prevention. So as we talked about, COVID is not the only virus that is affecting people nowadays. HIV is still here and will be here in the future. And come to see Dr. Fuller again at 6 p.m. She has a wealth of knowledge.
But there's a whole panel at 6, not just me.
Yes.
Amen.
All right. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much.
Have a good day. Stay safe.
Right. Bye-bye.